Hello, my name is Claudia Delgado, and this is my PowerPoint presentation on my paper about juvenile delinquency and the psychological impact of solitary confinement. So, to start with some background information, what is juvenile delinquency? So, juvenile delinquency refers to the illegal or antisocial behavior committed by minors, typically individuals under the age of 18. It's a complex social problem that extends beyond the individual offender, affecting families, communities, and then the broader criminal justice system. Juvenile delinquency often involves violent offenses, assault and robbery. It can be things of sexual nature, but it can also be nonviolent crimes. My paper highlights that juvenile delinquency is influenced by a variety of factors, including family issues, so growing up with a dysfunctional family that involves abuse, neglect, lack of parental support or supervision, economic hardship, so growing up in poverty. It limits access to jobs and educations, not just for the youth, but for their parents as well, their caregivers. Peer influence, so kids are highly influenced by their peers. They're involved with delinquent peers or gang affiliation, which can and will lead to criminal activity. Systematic factors play a role in it. It's not as big a role as the other things in my thoughts, but it is an issue. So, racial and economical disparities within the justice system do contribute to the equal treatment of juvenile offenders, particularly those marginalized from communities. Juvenile delinquency is a significant issue that requires comprehensive intervention strategies, including rehabilitation, prevention efforts, rather than purely punitive approaches, which means basically we want to rehabilitate versus discipline. So, what does that look like? After a juvenile commits a crime, they are processed, and what happens next depends on the legal system and the specific circumstances of their offense. However, the juvenile justice system typically follows these general steps. I summarized it pretty shortly for everybody because it can get very complex and detailed. But obviously, one, they're arrested. They will be arrested. They will be taken to the local detention center where they'll either be where they're going to be booked in and processed. Typically, especially around here, the youth will stay till the next day, and they'll have court at 1:15 the following day. So they'll go to court, then they'll have a detention hearing. The judge will determine if they're going to stay in detention, if they're going to be released on a conditional release agreement, um, those types of things. Then it's their sentencing. So they'll have like a review court date or a trial date, but usually those can lead to probation. Um, so you committed this offense, we're gonna give you probation instead of you serving any time, or you can just do community service. They'll send kids to programs instead of lodging them in detention or in corrections. They'll send them to a program to help rehabilitate them before the next steps will be taken into having them in actual secured close custody facility. The last one is incarceration. They're a little backwards on my slide, sorry. But incarceration. So they're either going to be lodged in detention up until their trial date or until their probation officer decides what they're going to do with them. Or they could go to corrections. So for the kids in this case, it would be kid prison, essentially. So a youth correctional institution. So in my paper, I highlight our local county detention and a youth correctional institution here in Oregon. So Jackson County Detention is going to be in the top left corner here. This is the community justice building for detention. The whole upper level is where all of the kids are housed. So this top right portion here is where the detention is. So the secure closed custody facility. They do not leave the building unless they have like some kind of medical emergency or they're being transported. And then we also do have a residential program, but it doesn't really relate right now. And then the whole bottom level, like where these offices are, is where our county probation officers are held. And then also we do have an abundance of Oregon Youth Authority probation and parole officers here as well. And then obviously clerical. This section right here, this is the detention pod. There are 20 rooms. Right now, 16 is the max capacity that Jackson County Detention can hold due to just safety and security issues. So these are their individual cells. They do not share rooms. These kids are in a little concrete block um, cell, and there's like a little concrete chunk that lifts off the floor, and there's a mattress on top, and that's their bed. but this is where they eat, sleep, go to school. This room back here is the classroom. And then obviously this is where they eat, and then this is where they sit for like groups and things like that. So this bottom portion is McLaren Youth Correctional Facility, which is located in Woodburn, Oregon. It is the biggest correctional facility in the state of Oregon. This whole front is I've never been there, but I have multiple people that I know that have been there. The front I know for sure is like the clerical courts. There are some of their probation and deputy directors are in this part of the building. So this whole section right here is the best way I could explain it would be on Google Maps. Is these weird jig-jag shaped look like houses are the dorms, which where the kids are um, incarcerated at. So the first two are like the intake dorms. So when they first get there, they're separated, cleared by like mental health, all that kind of stuff, and then they'll be integrated into these other units. And McLaren will separate basically by crime, what your crime is, and then your age. So they keep 18 to 23 in a separate place, and then they segregate those that could be sex offenders or just violent offenses separately. So there's no, they limit incidences. Um, then there's school, there's an indoor gym, all kinds of things. But this is the main area that we want to focus on. This is where the kids are housed, and this is where there's solitary confinement. They call it the intervention unit. This is where McLaren Youth Correctional Facility solitary confinement is at. I'm not sure which one of these it is, but I know they do have one, and they hold up to, I think, 20 kids. There's 20 individual cells. So the interjection for my paper. So when youth offenders are placed in solitary confinement, their emotional and psychological well-being will suffer in a negative way. I think anybody can agree if you're isolated in a tiny space, especially concrete, with no human interaction, you're gonna be impacted negatively. In the juvenile system, the topic of solitary is a very intense and considered highly controversial. Solitary confinement is basically where an individual is kept alone in a tiny concrete cell for 22 to 24 hours a day, could be for multiple days in a row, without hardly any interactions. The only thing these kids receive while they're in isolation, or the hole, as some people call it, is a narrow slot through the door, which their food and medication are given to them. Research indicates that solitary confinement harms young people's development because it targets their vulnerable emotions and psychological growth stages, despite being used mainly for disciplinary actions or for staff, other use, and the own use safety. The significance of this research arises because juvenile solitary confinement continues to be commonly applied, even though studies show it produces extensive damage, including mental health problems and poor social integration. The study investigates the effects of solitary confinement on juvenile offenders with a focus on changing their behavior patterns, mental health conditions, and recidivism rates. The study analyzes previous research and identifies trends in order to participate in the continuing discussion about juvenile solitary confinement, reform, or um, abolishing it. The research will generate policy suggestions to remedy the negative effects of solitary confinement practices and purposes, and find alternate measures to support young offenders' rehabilitation and getting back into society. So, obviously, solitary is going to be different based on each facility because I know that there are supermax prisons out there for some youth. We don't have like supermax here in Oregon. Um, but the one that I do know the most about is the McLaren Youth Correctional Facility that's located in Woodburn. And they do have specific sections for isolation. So, this part of the facility where the youth experience solitary, they go by the intervention unit, but that is solitary confinement. That has been confirmed. The detention center here in Jackson County, we don't have solitary confinement units or specific destinations for that. Um, they live in their own cells. So if they misbehave, they are confined to that space. Like if there's behavioral problems, mental health issues, any safety security issues, we will stick the youth into their room and close the door. So my literature review: why is solitary confinement problematic for young inmates? There have been numerous amount of studies on solitary confinement with juveniles. Those who have studied this, like researchers and scholars, have reported serious concerns about solitary and the negative effects it has on these kids. Um, Clark, one of my sources, identifies juvenile solitary confinement as a kind of child abuse, which generates serious psychological damage. The article demonstrates how children's developing brains and emotional states make them especially susceptible to harmful effects of isolation. Youth who are predisposed to abandonment issues experience worsening behaviors when confined to a small concrete space. Clark maintains that prolonged solitary confinement may lead to emotional breakdowns, anxiety, and depression, which can result in permanent psychological harm. So during my tenure at the Juvenile Detention Center, I personally saw this situation occur with a youth. So the female was very violent. She was moved to her room to protect her and ensure our safety along with the other youth. While she was isolated in her room, she went through a psychotic break. It led her to tear off her clothes, damage the mattress, and trying to self harm. She made it very clear she could not tolerate being confined in her room as if she were an animal. The combination of social withdrawal who resulted in solitary confinement, intensifies her behavior, and complicates her reintegration in society after release. We do know that she did struggle with, after speaking with the youth and the mom after probation checkup, she struggled with having doors closed at home. She did not want doors closed anymore, whether it was in her room, the bathroom. She slept with the light on just because of her time in detention. And this isn't even prison. This wasn't real solitary. This was just her being forced to be in a small space. So I can only imagine the damage that it does do to these kids who are actually in solitary. So the psychological and emotional impact of solitary. So mental health deterioration. Study demonstrates that young offenders who experience solitary suffer serious mental health damage. It also intensifies the pre-existing mental health disorders, which also deepen trauma, causing new psychological complications such as depression, along with paranoia and hallucinations. Extended periods of isolation lead to brain matter reduction in regions essential for emotional control and social interactions, according to research by one of my sources. There is developmental impacts. So the adolescent stage serves as an essential time frame for both emotional growth and cognitive advancement. Solitary interferes with this natural development process, which hinders emotional maturing and challenges with social readjustment once they're out. And then trauma implications. So when they enter the detention facilities, often they do have a history of trauma, physical, sexual abuse, violence. Um, so they're susceptible to just everything. Um, this makes rehabilitation a lot more challenging. Sorry, that's why when I uploaded it to PowerPoint, it was in the blue, so I want to make sure that everybody could read it. But it makes trying to rehabilitate them more challenging. So, alternatives. What are other things that we can do? So, rehabilitation over punishment is something that I repeat. I want to drill in the brain. Studies have revealed that rehabilitation focused approaches such as therapy and educational programs yield better outcomes than like punishment methods, which include solitary. It's one of the main punishment methods. Research demonstrates that CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, reduces repeat offenses and improves juveniles' emotional controls as well as their decision making. Educational programs are also a great alternative to solitary confinement. So, successful social reintegration depends on the access to educational programs, including high school diploma, courses, and vocational training. So, giving these youth the access to all of these additional educational opportunities will help motivate them in order to not deter to deviance and bad behaviors and um, putting them in positions where they are forced to be in solitary confinement, which is they're very easily susceptible to that in that kind of environment. So, according to research by one of my sources, in 2016, juvenile detention centers offered academic programs, experienced reduced recidivism rates, and improved outcomes for these young offenders. So, obviously, if you give them the opportunity, they're going to have the means to want to do better and not be placed um, somewhere like that. Family involvement. So, the rehabilitation of juveniles becomes more successful when they receive strong support from their families. Post release, these kids rely heavily on family counseling. They should. We should be relying on family counseling and parenting programs, which can reinforce positive behavior. So, giving them tools for success when they get out if they have anger management issues, and that's why they're being placed in solitary confinement every other week. If we give them, when they get out, we give them those opportunities to have family counseling or parenting classes, it could help them. So, real examples of policy reforms. So, in my paper, I talk about Ohio's initiative, and Ohio successfully reduced solitary confinement issues in their detention centers, which led to decreased violence and better mental health outcomes, which is amazing. I feel like we should all be doing what Ohio has done. Also, another is restorative justice. So, this is practiced everywhere. Um, so, the offenders participate in restorative justice programs that involve interactions with victims and community members that have demonstrated low recidivism rates while developing stronger accountability. Studies show restorative programs result in decreased recidivism rates when compared to um, punishment approaches. So, policy and change. What can be changed? Policy reforms, recommendations to reform efforts. So, by passing legislations to restrict or eliminate solitary confinement, states like California and New York have achieved improved mental health outcomes and decreased the rates of recidivism. So, it's been decreasing the rates of these youth coming back. The therapeutic environment model, so that emphasizes mental health care alongside educational and emotional development, is becoming more common in juvenile detention centers. Policy recommendations, we could eliminate the use of solitary, obviously, for their mental and emotional health. Implement rehabilitation programs through therapy combined with educational opportunities, and have family support system if they don't have a family that is a positive support system, some kind of adult that has known this kid. And then community-based initiatives that will support these at-risk youth, which will stop them from entering detentions and possibly like adult jail time. The future. I believe that if we have, it's a long road ahead. There's a lot of things that need to be changed. It's not just policies and laws. It's money, time, staffing. There's so much that goes around changing things with solitary confinement, but just having it be more peaceful for the youth. In short words, obviously they have made adult decisions and done adult crimes, but at the end of the day, they still are kids and they are our future and they are the youth. So if we're constantly punishing, and we're not helping them restore anything to help them reintegrate into our communities, then we're just setting them up for failure. So while we have them in our custody and they're forced to be there, we can make a huge impact and difference in these kids' lives. So, the conclusion, to wrap everything up. So, the practice of solitary fails to serve as a valid approach to handle juvenile delinquency. Time and time again, these kids are going back to solitary, back to solitary. Um, we kind of just throw them in there and walk away. The practice results in psychological damage. So, while kids are in there, they are suffering mentally and stunning their emotional development, which creates a high risk of future criminal behavior. So, their time in solitary could very well lead them to have adult charges and eventually go to jail or prison, which it's not what we want. Rehabilitation programs instead of punishment approaches enable traumatized juveniles to recover and get back into our society effectively. I think it's essential that to reform policies in order to safeguard mental health, welfare of young people, and give them access to tools that can help them escape from the repetitive pattern of their criminal behavior of imprisonment. So we can help deter these youth if we change some of our policies. I just want to thank you all for listening to my presentation, and I look forward to listening and reading all of yours. I am going to show you my sources. They're very, very tiny. I'm sorry I didn't want to have like 3 or 4 pages of sources, but these are all of my sources that I use in my paper. 20 of them are peer-reviewed, which I found on the Hannon Library, and then the rest are some that I did find on my own. Thank you, and good luck.